The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, which Elena Martinez would later remember as significant only because Tuesdays had always been her longest days. She worked the early shift at the diner, the kind that started before sunrise and ended when her feet had gone numb. Inside shoes held together with duct tape and determination. Then came the afternoon hours at the grocery store, scanning items for people who never quite met her eyes, their carts full of abundance she could only afford to imagine. By the time she reached her apartment, a third-floor walk-up in a building that had given up on maintenance sometime in the previous decade, the mail was usually the last thing on her mind. But that Tuesday, as she climbed the stairs with her daughter Sofia's hand in hers, the child chattering about something that had happened at school, Elena noticed the official-looking envelope wedged between bills she could not pay and advertisements for services she could not afford. The return address meant nothing to her. Rothman and Associates, attorneys at law, from a town she had never heard of on the northern coast. She opened it standing in the hallway, still wearing her grocery store vest, while Sofia played with a toy she had found in a cereal box weeks earlier and treated like treasure. The letter was formal, written in language that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. It took her 3 readings to extract the essential information. Her uncle, Tomas Reyes, had died. She had not known she had an uncle named Tomas Reyes. The family tree on her mother's side had always been sparse, pruned by distance and silence. But apparently, this man had existed, had lived alone for decades in a place called Whitehaven Point, and had left her something in his will. A property, the letter said. A former research station. The address was listed, along with a phone number she was instructed to call to arrange the transfer. There was no mention of value, no indication of whether this inheritance was a gift or a burden. Elena stood there, her daughter's voice a distant hum, feeling the weight of the envelope as though it contained something more than paper. She called the number that evening after Sofia had gone to bed, after she had calculated the week's remaining grocery money and realized they were 3 days short. The attorney who answered spoke with the practiced patience of someone who had delivered this information before and knew it would not be received with joy. The property, he explained, was a decommissioned weather research station built in the 1972 to study coastal fog patterns. It had been abandoned for years, deemed too expensive to maintain and too remote to repurpose. The building was structurally unsound, the equipment inside was obsolete, and the land itself was in a zone prone to erosion. The county had been prepared to condemn it before her uncle's death, and his estate had settled outstanding taxes only to avoid further penalties. So, it's worthless, Elena said quietly. More statement than question. The attorney hesitated. It has value as property, technically, but it would require significant investment to make it habitable or sellable. Most people in your position choose to disclaim the inheritance rather than accept the liability. Elena closed her eyes. Of course, even in death, even from a relative she had never known, what came to her was not opportunity, but obligation. She should decline. She knew that. Accepting the property meant accepting whatever problems came with it. Taxes, maintenance, legal responsibilities she could barely afford to think about. But something in her resisted the idea of refusing. Perhaps it was exhaustion with a life that offered her nothing but choices between bad and worse. Perhaps it was the absurd hope that something, anything, might exist in this world that was not exactly what it appeared to be. Or perhaps it was simply that Sofia deserved to believe her mother could surprise her, that life contained possibilities beyond the narrow corridor they had been walking for years. "I'll take it," Elena said before she could reconsider. The attorney's pause was long enough to communicate his opinion. "I'll prepare the paperwork." 3 weeks later, Elena stood in the parking lot of a bus station in Whitehaven Point, A town so small it seemed to exist only as a marker between larger places. The air tasted of salt and carried a dampness that settled into her clothes immediately. Fog hung low over everything, not thick enough to obscure, but present enough to make the world feel muted, softened, as though reality here operated under different rules. She had brought Sofia with her, unable to afford childcare and unwilling to leave her daughter with neighbors she barely knew. The girl stood close, her small backpack decorated with cartoon characters that had been her favorites 2 years ago, before Elena had stopped being able to afford new things. The taxi driver who took them to the property was an older man who spoke little, his eyes flicking to them in the rearview mirror with an expression Elena could not quite read. Curiosity, perhaps, or pity. When she told him the address, he nodded slowly. "The old fog station," he said. "Been empty a long time." "You knew my uncle?" "Knew of him. Kept to himself. People said he was studying something out there, but nobody knew what. After a while, folks just stopped asking." The drive took them away from the small cluster of buildings that constituted the town's center, along a narrow road that hugged the coastline. The ocean appeared in glimpses through the fog, gray and restless. The landscape was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, all rock and wind-bent vegetation. Elena found herself wondering what kind of person chose to live here alone, what they were looking for or running from. The research station appeared suddenly, emerging from the fog like something that had been waiting. It was larger than she had expected, a sprawling 2-story structure built primarily of concrete and steel, its design functional rather than aesthetic. Large windows, many of them broken or boarded, punctuated the facade. A tall antenna tower rose from the roof, leaning slightly, its guy wires sagging. The taxi stopped in what had once been a parking area, now overrun with weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. Elena paid the driver, using bills she had carefully counted 3 times before leaving home, and watched him pull away with a speed that suggested relief. They stood alone then, she and Sofia, before a building that looked less like an inheritance and more like a monument to abandonment. The fog pressed close, and in the distance she could hear something mechanical, a rhythmic creaking that might have been a loose shutter or a failing hinge. "Mama," Sofia said quietly, her hand finding Elena's. "It looks scary." Elena squeezed her daughter's hand, feeling the smallness of it, the trust it represented. "It's just old, baby. Old things always look scary before you understand them." She was not sure she believed that, but it was what Sofia needed to hear, and so it became true enough. The front door was unlocked, its handle cold and stiff. It opened with a groan that echoed through the fog, and Elena stepped inside, pulling Sofia with her into a darkness that smelled of mold, rust, and decades of stillness. Her phone's flashlight revealed a large entry hall lined with filing cabinets and metal shelves, most of them empty or containing water-damaged papers. The floor was concrete, surprisingly clean despite the neglect, as though the building had been sealed against intrusion, rather than simply abandoned. To her left, a staircase ascended into shadow. To her right, a corridor stretched toward what she assumed were laboratories or workrooms. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the distant creak of metal. Elena moved slowly, methodically, trying to catalogue what she saw, in terms that made sense. Equipment that meant nothing to her. Instruments whose purposes she could not guess. Everywhere. The residue of work that had stopped mid-motion, as though her uncle had simply walked away one day and never returned. In what appeared to be a control room, she found a desk still covered with notebooks. The handwriting was dense, technical, filled with measurements and observations that read like poetry in a language she did not speak. Dates stretched back decades, entries made with obsessive regularity. Her uncle had been meticulous, whatever he had been doing here. Sofia tugged at her sleeve. "Can we go upstairs?" The second floor was in worse condition. Water had leaked through the roof in several places, leaving stains and warping that made the floorboards unsafe in spots. But one room at the far end appeared intact, its door closed, and, when she opened it, revealing a space that looked almost preserved. It had been a living quarter, sparse, utilitarian, but clearly inhabited. A narrow bed with military precision in its made sheets, a small desk with a lamp, shelves lined with books, many of them about meteorology, oceanography, and subjects Elena recognized only as scientific. On the wall, a single photograph in a simple frame. Elena approached it slowly, her heart beating faster without understanding why. The photograph showed a young woman holding a baby. The woman's face was familiar in a way that made Elena's breath catch. She looked like Elena's mother. No, she looked like Elena herself. The resemblance so strong, it was disorienting. She turned the frame over. On the back, in faded ink, Rosalia and Elena, 1988. Elena stared at the words, her mind struggling to assemble meaning. Rosalia had been her mother's name. The baby was her, which meant the photograph had been kept here, in this isolated place, by a man she had never known, an uncle who had possessed proof of her existence and had never once reached out. The discovery should have made her angry. Instead, it made her feel hollow, as though she were standing in the presence of a grief she had not known existed. Her mother had died when Elena was 12, taking with her whatever explanations might have existed for the family's silence. Now this stranger, this relative, who had lived and died alone, had left her a building full of questions and nothing resembling answers. "Mama, what's that?" Sofia was pointing at something Elena had not noticed, a metal hatch set into the floor near the window. It was flush with the boards, barely visible, its edges sealed with rubber gaskets that suggested it had been designed to be airtight. Elena knelt beside it, running her fingers along the seam. There was a recessed handle, and when she pulled, the hatch resisted at first, then gave way with a hiss of escaping air that smelled faintly chemical, sterile. Below was a ladder descending into darkness, its rungs bolted to a concrete shaft. The beam of her flashlight revealed only the first few feet before the light was swallowed entirely. Every instinct told her to close the hatch, to leave this place and return to the life she knew, however difficult it was. This building was not a gift. It was a liability, just as the attorney had said. Whatever lay below was not her problem. But Sofia was watching her with those wide, trusting eyes, and Elena had spent too many years teaching her daughter to be brave, to face things even when they were frightening. She could not model caution now without teaching a different lesson, one about surrender. "Stay right here," Elena said firmly. "Do not move from this spot. I'm going to look, and I'll be right back." She descended slowly, testing each rung before trusting it with her full weight. The shaft went deeper than she expected, the air growing cooler as she climbed down. At the bottom, perhaps 20 feet below the floor above, her feet found solid ground. The space opened into a narrow corridor, its walls lined with the same concrete as the building above. But this was different. This was not abandoned. Lights flickered on automatically as she moved forward, dim but functional, powered by some system that had outlasted the building itself. The corridor ended at a heavy door, its surface marked with warnings she could barely read in the low light. She pushed it open, her heart pounding now with something beyond curiosity, something closer to dread. The room beyond was vast, far larger than should have been possible beneath the modest footprint of the research station. It was filled with equipment, massive cylindrical tanks connected by pipes and valves, their surfaces beaded with condensation. Control panels lined one wall, their displays dark, but their construction suggesting technology more advanced than anything she had seen upstairs. And in the center of it all, suspended within a transparent enclosure, was something that made Elena stop breathing. It looked like fog, but it was not fog. It moved with purpose, swirling in patterns that repeated and evolved, forming shapes that almost resembled something before dissolving again. The enclosure was refrigerated, maintaining a temperature cold enough that frost had formed on the glass. Yet whatever was inside remained gaseous, refusing to settle. Elena approached slowly, her reflection distorting in the cold glass. The fog inside seemed to respond to her presence, its movements becoming more agitated, more focused. She reached out, not quite touching the surface, and the fog pressed against the glass from within, as though trying to meet her hand. A screen mounted nearby flickered to life, displaying text that scrolled too quickly to read. Then it stopped, holding on a single entry dated 3 weeks earlier, the day after her uncle's death. Final observation: the sample has achieved stability. Containment protocols remain effective. Asset value confirmed at $685 million USD based on current pharmaceutical applications. Recommend immediate, secure transfer. In the event of my death, property and contents transfer to designated heir as arranged. Elena read the words 3 times, then 4. The numbers refused to make sense in any context that aligned with reality. 685 million, not thousand, not a mistake, million. She looked around the room, at the equipment that suddenly appeared less like abandoned research and more like a functional laboratory, at the tanks that must contain whatever her uncle had extracted or created from the fog, at the transparent prison holding something that pharmaceutical companies apparently valued at a sum she could not comprehend. Her legs felt weak. She sat down on the cold floor, her mind racing through implications she was not equipped to process. This was not an abandoned building. It was a vault. Her uncle had not died, leaving her a burden. He had died, leaving her a fortune, hidden beneath a structure everyone believed was worthless. The sound of Sofia calling from above snapped her back to awareness. Elena scrambled up the ladder, emerging into the room where her daughter waited, concern written across her small face. "I'm okay, baby," Elena said, pulling Sofia into a hug. "Everything's okay." But nothing was okay. Nothing would be okay again. Because Elena Martinez, who measured her life in dollars, stretched too thin, and hours worked for wages that never caught up to need, had just inherited something that would make her either unimaginably rich or unimaginably endangered. She did not yet know which. What she did know, standing in that cold room with her daughter in her arms and a fortune hidden beneath her feet, was that the fog outside was not the only thing capable of obscuring truth. Sometimes the most valuable things in the world were buried precisely where everyone had been taught not to look. The walk back to town took longer than Elena had anticipated. She had intended to call another taxi, but her phone had no signal this far from the main road, and the fog had thickened to the point where visibility had become a suggestion rather than a certainty. Sofia complained once about being tired, then seemed to sense her mother's distraction, and went quiet, her small hand clutching Elena's with determination. Elena's mind was still in the room below, standing before that strange contained fog and the numbers on the screen that refused to arrange themselves into anything resembling her reality. $685 million. The phrase repeated in her head like a glitch in a recording, each repetition stripping it of meaning until it was just sounds, empty of consequence. She tried to remember what the attorney had said when she accepted the property. Something about liability, about taxes, about the wisdom of disclaiming an inheritance that appeared worthless. He had not known, or he had not been told. Her uncle had kept the secret even from the lawyers handling his estate, describing the property in terms designed to repel interest rather than invite it. The question she could not escape was why? Why hide such value? Why live alone in that decaying station, maintaining equipment in secret, never converting the asset into something that could improve his life? And why, in the end, leave it to her, a niece he had never met, whose existence he had acknowledged only through a photograph kept in an empty room? They reached the edge of town as the afternoon light began to fail, filtered through fog that seemed to pulse with its own dull luminescence. The main street was quiet, its businesses closing early or perhaps never having opened. Elena found herself observing details she had missed on arrival. The way people moved with their heads down, their conversations muted, as though the town itself had learned to be inconspicuous. She needed information, but she was not sure who to trust with questions. The attorney was an obvious choice, but involving lawyers meant revealing what she had found, and revelation felt dangerous in ways she could not yet articulate. What she needed first was context, someone who had known her uncle, who could explain not just what he had left her, but why it had been worth hiding. The local library was still open, a small single-room building that looked more like someone's converted garage than a public institution. Elena brought Sofia inside, grateful for the warmth and the stacks of children's books that immediately captured her daughter's attention. She approached the desk where an older woman sat, her reading glasses perched on a chain around her neck. "Excuse me," Elena began carefully. "I'm looking for information about Tomas Reyes. He lived at the old fog research station." The woman's expression shifted subtly, from polite attention to something more guarded. "You family?" "His niece. I just inherited the property." A long pause followed, during which the woman studied Elena with an intensity that felt like assessment. Then she stood, motioning for Elena to follow her to a back corner where older materials were stored in filing cabinets that looked older than the building. "Your uncle was private," the woman said quietly, pulling out a folder thick with newspaper clippings and photocopied documents. "But people talk, especially in a town this small. He was here before most of us, came in the 70s when the station was still operational, government-funded research into coastal weather patterns." Or that's what they told everyone. She laid the folder open on a reading table. The clippings were yellowed, their headlines barely legible. Most were brief mentions, local news about funding cuts or personnel changes at the research facility. But one article, dated 1982, was longer, its tone markedly different. "Mysterious illness strikes Whitehaven Point residents. Federal investigation launched." Elena read quickly, absorbing details that felt increasingly surreal. Dozens of townspeople had fallen ill over a period of weeks, experiencing symptoms that defied conventional diagnosis. Respiratory issues, neurological disturbances, something described as altered consciousness. The federal government had sent investigators, closed the research station temporarily, and eventually concluded that the illnesses were the result of naturally occurring algae blooms that had been exacerbated by unusually persistent fog conditions. The station had reopened, but most of its staff had been reassigned. Only one researcher had remained, Tomas Reyes, who had insisted on continuing his work despite recommendations that the facility be permanently shuttered. "They said it was algae," the librarian continued, her voice low. "But people here remember differently. The fog that year was wrong. It came in patterns, lingered in places it shouldn't have, moved against the wind. Your uncle was the only one who stayed to study it. And after that, he never published anything, never spoke about his work. He just existed out there, alone. Elena stared at the article, her chest tightening. Do you think he caused the illnesses? No, the woman said firmly. I think he was trying to understand them, and I think whatever he found was significant enough that someone decided it should never be made public. The implications pressed against Elena's understanding like the fog against glass. Her uncle had not been hiding wealth for its own sake. He had been hiding knowledge, and the fortune she had discovered was merely the byproduct of research that someone, somewhere, had wanted contained. She thanked the librarian and gathered Sofia, who protested, leaving the warmth and books. Outside, the fog had thickened further, reducing the street to a corridor of dim shapes and muffled sounds. Elena carried her daughter now, feeling the weight of exhaustion in her shoulders and the sharper weight of awareness in her mind. They found a motel at the edge of town, the kind that existed to serve travelers who had misjudged distances or been caught by weather. The room was small and cold, with wallpaper that had peeled in corners and a heater that rattled more than it warmed. Sofia fell asleep almost immediately, curled beneath blankets that smelled of industrial detergent. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, her phone finally finding enough signal to function. She pulled up news articles about pharmaceutical research, about fog-related phenomena, about any intersection between the two that might explain what her uncle had created. The search results were overwhelming and useless. Thousands of entries that might have been relevant, or might have been noise. What she needed was someone who understood the science, who could tell her whether the equipment she had seen was real or elaborate theater, whether the number on that screen was remotely plausible. But reaching out to experts meant exposure, and exposure meant losing control of something she barely understood she possessed. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her manager at the diner, asking when she would return to work. Elena stared at it, trying to reconcile the person she had been 3 days ago, who would have responded immediately with apologies and reassurances, with the person she was becoming, who could not quite convince herself that morning shifts mattered anymore. She did not respond. Instead, she lay down beside Sofia, listening to her daughter's quiet breathing and the sound of fog pressing against the window like something alive. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it was shallow and fractured, filled with images of underground rooms and contained storms, of her uncle's handwriting covering pages in observations that no one was meant to read. She woke to Sofia's voice and weak daylight filtering through curtains that had not quite closed. Her daughter was standing at the window, her small hands pressed against the glass. "Mama, someone's outside." Elena was upright instantly, moving to the window with her heart already accelerating. A car was parked in the motel lot, its engine running, exhaust visible in the cold morning air. A man sat behind the wheel, his face obscured by fog and tinted glass, but his posture suggested waiting, watching. She pulled the curtain closed and stepped back, her mind cycling through explanations. A motel guest, someone lost, nothing sinister. But the tension in her shoulders told a different story, the one written by years of learning to recognize threat, even when it wore the costume of coincidence. They left through a side door, avoiding the parking lot, and walked quickly toward the town center. Elena kept glancing back, checking for the car, for any indication they were being followed. The fog made certainty impossible, every shape a potential presence, every sound a possible approach. She needed help, but she had no one to call. The attorney would advise her to involve authorities, and authorities would ask questions she could not answer, without revealing everything. Her mother's family, the relatives who had never acknowledged her existence, were not suddenly going to become allies because she possessed something valuable. The realization settled in her with cold clarity. She was alone in this, not by choice, but by design. Her uncle had left her the inheritance precisely because she had no connections, no resources, no platform from which to make claims or demands. She was meant to be overwhelmed, to disclaim the property or fail to protect it, allowing it to pass to whoever came next. But that logic had underestimated one variable. Elena had spent her entire adult life being underestimated, being dismissed as someone who did not matter enough to warrant attention. She had learned to use that dismissal as camouflage, to operate beneath the notice of those who controlled resources and determined outcomes. She could do it again now. She could become invisible precisely when visibility would destroy her. They reached a small cafe that advertised breakfast in hand-painted letters. Elena ordered coffee and food she knew Sofia would eat, then asked the waitress if there was someone in town who handled property maintenance, someone discreet who would not ask too many questions. The waitress studied her for a moment, then wrote a name and number on a napkin. Marcus. He's expensive, but he knows how to mind his business. Tell him Dolores sent you. Elena made the call from a payphone outside, feeling the absurdity of resorting to technology she had thought obsolete. Marcus answered on the third ring, his voice gravel-rough but not unfriendly. She explained what she needed: basic security for the research station, someone to watch it without entering, to report if anyone approached. There was a pause. That's Ray's old place. You the one inherited it? Yes. People been curious about that property for years. Your uncle kept everyone away, but now he's gone. The implication hung unfinished. I can watch it. But if trouble comes, I'm not getting involved. I'll tell you, and then I'm done. That's all I need. They agreed on a price that felt extravagant for what she was asking, but Elena paid it with money she could not afford to spend. The investment was necessary, not to protect the property, but to buy time. Time to understand what she had, time to decide what to do with it. She returned to the cafe where Sofia was drawing on the back of a paper menu, her concentration absolute. Elena sat down and tried to eat, though the food tasted like nothing. Her phone buzzed again, this time a voicemail from a number she did not recognize. The message was brief, professional. Miss Martinez, this is Gerald Rothman. We need to discuss your uncle's property. Please call me at your earliest convenience. There are complications you should be aware of. Elena deleted the message without responding. Complications. The word was almost laughable. She was sitting in a fog-shrouded town she had never heard of, in possession of a fortune she did not understand, being watched by people she could not identify, and carrying a responsibility she had never asked for. Complications did not begin to cover it. But beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion and confusion, something else was taking root. It was not hope, exactly, or determination. It was simpler than that. It was the stubborn refusal to be erased, to let herself become one more person who had glimpsed possibility only to have it taken away before she could even name it. Her uncle had hidden his discovery for decades, maintaining it alone until his death. He had chosen her, for reasons she might never understand, to inherit not just the asset, but the burden of deciding what to do with it. She would not make that decision from a place of panic or ignorance. She would learn, she would understand, and then, whatever came next, it would be her choice. Sofia finished her drawing and pushed it across the table. It showed two figures, one tall and one small, standing before a house. Above them, she had drawn clouds, or perhaps fog, rendered in careful circular motions that filled the sky. That's us, Sofia said simply. At our new house. Elena looked at the drawing, at her daughter's interpretation of the derelict research station as home, and felt something shift in her chest. Not warmth, exactly, but a recognition that Sofia's perspective was not wrong. They had lived in worse places, smaller apartments, buildings with neighbors who screamed, and walls that leaked cold. The research station was large, isolated, and came with secrets that could destroy them. But it was also theirs, in a way nothing had ever been before. And beneath it, hidden in rooms that still smelled of her uncle's work, was the potential for a future that did not require her to measure her life in shifts and tips and calculations of how many days until rent was due. She folded the drawing carefully and put it in her pocket. Then she stood, took Sofia's hand, and walked back out into the fog, toward the research station, toward whatever came next. The research station looked different in daylight, though calling what filtered through the perpetual fog daylight felt like generosity. Elena approached it with Sofia's hand in hers, both of them silent as they took in details that had been obscured by darkness and shock during their first visit. The building's concrete facade was streaked with rust stains, where metal reinforcements had corroded, giving it the appearance of something wounded rather than merely old. Marcus was already there when they arrived, his truck parked at an angle that suggested both readiness to leave and commitment to staying. He was younger than Elena had expected from his voice, perhaps mid-40s, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He nodded as they approached, but did not offer his hand or any greeting beyond acknowledgement. "Perimeter's secure," he said simply. "No signs of entry since your uncle passed, but there are tire tracks near the access road, recent ones. Someone's been watching." Elena felt her stomach tighten. How recent? Yesterday, maybe the day before. They didn't approach the building, just parked and observed. He glanced at Sofia, then back at Elena. "Whatever you're planning to do here, do it fast. Curiosity doesn't usually wait long in situations like this." She thanked him and watched as he settled into a position near the entrance, his posture relaxed, but his attention clearly focused. The fog helped, she realized. It made observation difficult in both directions. Anyone watching the building would have trouble seeing clearly inside, but it also meant she would have little warning if they chose to approach. Inside, the station felt colder than she remembered, the kind of cold that came not from temperature, but from absence, from decades of being uninhabited. Elena led Sofia to the room upstairs where she had found the photograph, settling her daughter with the books they had brought from the motel and strict instructions not to move. "I need to work downstairs for a while," Elena explained. "If you need me, call loudly. I'll hear you." Sofia nodded with the seriousness of a child who understood that something important was happening, even if she could not name it. Elena descended through the hatch in the floor, her movements more confident now that shock had given way to purpose. The underground laboratory was exactly as she had left it, the equipment humming with the same low consistency, the contained fog moving in its endless patterns. This time, she approached the control panels with intention, running her hands over switches and dials, trying to decipher the logic of their arrangement. Most of the equipment was labeled, though the terminology meant little to her. Cryogenic maintenance, pressure regulation, molecular stability monitors. The screens displayed graphs and numbers that formed patterns she could not interpret, cascading data that suggested continuous measurement of something she lacked the vocabulary to name. She found her uncle's notebooks in a cabinet beneath one of the workstations, their pages filled with the same dense handwriting she had seen upstairs. The entries were dated, spanning decades, and she opened the earliest one, dated 1979, hoping for context that might make sense of what she was seeing. Day 1. Initial samples collected from coastal formation during sustained fog event. Properties: unusual density variations, inconsistent with standard vapor behavior. Preliminary analysis suggests presence of suspended particulates of unknown origin. Team skeptical but willing to pursue. Elena turned pages, skimming through entries that grew progressively more technical and, she sensed, more urgent in tone. Her uncle documented patterns in the fog's behavior, correlations between its appearance and specific atmospheric conditions, attempts to replicate its properties in controlled environments. Then came the entry she had been unconsciously searching for, dated August 1982, day 847. The outbreak has been contained, officially attributed to algae bloom. This is incorrect. The fog itself is the vector, though explaining its mechanism would require acknowledging properties that current meteorological models cannot account for. The particulates are not inert. They interact with mammalian neurology in ways that suggest intentionality, though that term will never appear in official reports. Federal oversight has mandated cessation of research. Staff reassignment pending. I have been offered relocation with full benefits. I am declining. Whatever this phenomenon is, abandoning it now would be professionally irresponsible and potentially catastrophic. If the properties can be harmful, they can also be controlled. And if controlled, they can be directed toward therapeutic applications. The words sent a chill through Elena that had nothing to do with the laboratory's temperature. Her uncle had known the fog was dangerous, had seen it harm people, and had chosen to continue working with it alone, in secret, for decades. She flipped forward, watching the research evolve from observation to experimentation. Her uncle had developed methods for isolating specific components of the fog, for storing them under conditions that maintained their active properties. He had tested these isolates on cell cultures, on animal models, documenting effects that ranged from cellular regeneration to neural pathway modification. The terminology became increasingly pharmaceutical, referencing compounds and mechanisms that Elena recognized from prescription bottles she had handled at the pharmacy, where she occasionally filled shifts. Her uncle had been trying to create medicine from something that had once caused illness, to transform a weapon into a cure. An entry from 1995 was marked with a star in the margin. Breakthrough. Isolated compound. Demonstrates unprecedented efficacy in treating neurodegenerative conditions. Cognitive function. Restoration in test subjects exceeds anything in current literature. Mechanism appears to involve direct neural tissue repair at cellular level. If this can be reproduced and scaled, we are looking at applications that would revolutionize treatment for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, traumatic brain injury, possibly even stroke recovery. Problem: cannot publish without revealing source. Cannot reveal source without triggering federal intervention and likely confiscation of all materials. The original mandate was clear: this research is not to continue. My choice is silence or surrender. I choose silence. Elena sat down on the cold floor, the notebook open in her lap. The magnitude of what her uncle had accomplished was almost incomprehensible to her. He had not just discovered something valuable. He had discovered something that could change millions of lives. And he had done it alone, in a condemned building, with equipment he had maintained through sheer will. And then he had chosen not to share it. Not out of greed, she was beginning to understand, but out of fear. Fear that the discovery would be taken from him, weaponized, monopolized by entities with resources to exploit it, but no obligation to make it available to those who needed it most. The number she had seen on the screen, $685 million, suddenly felt less like a valuation and more like a warning. Someone, somewhere, had calculated what these compounds were worth on the pharmaceutical market. They had assessed the research station not as an abandoned building, but as a repository of intellectual property worth a fortune. Elena returned to the control panel, looking more carefully at the screens. One of them displayed what appeared to be an inventory, listing quantities of isolated compounds by designation code. The numbers were substantial, years' worth of extraction and refinement, all stored in the cryogenic tanks that lined the walls. Another screen showed security logs, time-stamped entries recording environmental conditions and system status. She scrolled back, looking for anomalies, and found one immediately. 3 weeks ago, on the day after her uncle's death, someone had accessed the laboratory. The entry was brief: remote monitoring activated, transfer protocols engaged. Her breath caught. Someone had been here, or someone had accessed the system remotely, preparing to move the contents before she even knew she had inherited them. The inheritance had not been kept secret from everyone, only from her, until it was too late for the true interested parties to prevent the transfer. She heard Sofia's voice calling from above, high and frightened. Elena was up the ladder instantly, emerging into the room to find her daughter pressed against the wall, pointing toward the window. "Someone's walking around outside," Sofia whispered. "I saw them in the fog." Elena moved to the window carefully, staying to the side to avoid being seen. The fog made everything uncertain, but she could make out movement, a figure circling the building with deliberate slowness. Not Marcus, his posture was different, his movements less cautious. She pulled her phone from her pocket and called Marcus. He answered immediately. "There's someone else here," Elena said quietly, approaching from the east side. "I see them. Stay inside and away from windows. I'll handle it." Elena pulled Sofia close, both of them crouching below the window line. She could hear raised voices outside, muffled by distance and fog, but not friendly. The conversation was brief, and then came the sound of an engine starting, receding into the distance. Minutes later, Marcus appeared at the base of the stairs, his expression grim. "Reporter?" he said flatly. "From one of those investigative outlets. Said he'd been researching your uncle's work. Wanted to know if you'd be willing to talk about what he left behind." Elena's mind raced. "Did you tell him anything?" "Told him this was private property, and he was trespassing. He left without argument, but he'll be back, and he won't be alone." Marcus paused, studying her. "Whatever's in this building, it's not going to stay secret much longer. You need to decide what you're doing with it before that decision gets made for you." He was right, and Elena knew it. The window for acting privately, for making choices without external pressure, was closing rapidly. She had perhaps days, maybe less, before the research station became the focus of attention she could not control. She needed expertise. She needed someone who could verify what she had found, who could tell her whether her uncle's research was legitimate or the delusion of an isolated man who had lost perspective decades ago. But approaching experts meant exposure, and exposure meant vulnerability. Unless she approached someone who had as much to lose from disclosure as she did. The thought came to her suddenly, formed from pieces of information that had been floating separately in her mind. The attorney, Rothman, had left a message mentioning complications. He had known her uncle, had handled his estate. If there were secrets to be kept, Rothman had been keeping them already. She called the number he had left, and he answered on the second ring. "Miss Martinez, I'm glad you returned my call. You said there were complications." "Yes." His tone was measured, carefully neutral. "Your uncle's will was structured in an unusual way. The property transfer was straightforward. But there are additional assets that were not included in the public filing. Assets that require discussion before they can be properly addressed." Elena felt a wave of relief mixed with caution. "Are you talking about what's in the underground laboratory?" The pause that followed was loaded with significance. "You've already discovered it then?" "Yes, that's what I need to discuss with you. In person, if possible. Today, if you can manage it." They agreed to meet at his office in 2 hours. Elena gathered Sofia, locked the research station as securely as the old mechanisms allowed, and made arrangements with Marcus to continue monitoring the property. The drive back to town felt longer than it should have, the fog pressing close, reducing the world to a narrow corridor of grey uncertainty. Rothman's office was above a hardware store, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked with age. The space was small but organized, its walls lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves that spoke of decades of careful record-keeping. Rothman himself was in his 70s, his hair white and thinning, his suit immaculate despite its age. He offered Elena a chair and poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing for hours. Sofia was given paper and crayons, which she accepted with quiet politeness, understanding somehow that adults needed to talk about serious things. "Your uncle was my client for 43 years, Rothman began. "I handled his legal affairs from the day he decided to stay at that research station permanently. I also handled the aftermath of the federal investigation in 1982, though most of that work was done quietly, through channels that no longer exist officially." He opened a folder on his desk, its contents organized with the same meticulous care Elena had seen in her uncle's notebooks. Tomas was a brilliant man, also a stubborn one. When the government ordered him to cease his research, he complied publicly while continuing privately. He knew he was taking risks, both legal and personal. He asked me to help him structure protections. What kind of protections? Legal shields, trusts, arrangements that would keep his work separate from his estate in ways that made it difficult to trace or confiscate. When he died, the research station itself became yours automatically. But the contents, the compounds, the research, the equipment, those are held in a trust that requires specific conditions to be met before transfer. Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. What conditions? That you demonstrate understanding of the materials and commitment to their ethical management. Your uncle did not want his life's work to become the property of pharmaceutical companies or government agencies that would either weaponize it or bury it. He wanted it in the hands of someone who would prioritize its healing applications. "But I'm not a scientist. I don't have the training to—" "No," Rothman interrupted gently, "but you have something he valued more than credentials. You have need, personal, desperate need. He believed that someone who understood the stakes at a human level would be more likely to make moral choices than someone who understood only the profit potential." He slid a document across the desk. "This is the trust agreement. It outlines your responsibilities and the resources available to support you. There's funding not unlimited, but substantial. Access to consultants who worked with your uncle in the early days, before the shutdown. Legal protection against certain types of interference, though that protection has limits." Elena scanned the document, her eyes catching on numbers that made her breath stop. The trust held not just the compounds in the laboratory, but patents her uncle had filed under pseudonyms, investments made with profits from limited sales to research institutions, and property rights that extended beyond the research station itself. She could not finish the sentence. The wealth was real, verified, structured in ways that made it accessible once she satisfied the trust's requirements. "It's conditional," Rothman reminded her, "and the conditions are demanding. You must maintain the security of the facility. You must prevent unauthorized access to the compounds. And most importantly, you must make a good faith effort to understand the research and determine how it should be used. How long do I have? 6 months to demonstrate compliance with the basic requirements. After that, the trustee, which is me, for now will assess whether you're meeting the terms. If not, the trust's assets will be donated to a research foundation with no connection to you. You'll retain the building, but nothing else. Sofia tugged at Elena's sleeve, holding up a drawing she had made. It showed a woman standing in front of a large building, with stars or perhaps snowflakes falling around her. Elena took it, studying the careful lines, the way her daughter had tried to capture something hopeful, even in a situation she did not fully understand. "I'll do it," Elena said quietly, looking back at Rothman. "Whatever the requirements are, I'll meet them." The attorney nodded, unsurprised. "I expected you would. Your uncle chose well, I think. But Miss Martinez, you need to understand the danger. The people who wanted this research 40 years ago still want it now. They have more resources, more sophistication, and more willingness to take risks. The fog that almost destroyed this town once is now valuable, precisely because it's dangerous. Managing that value will require more than good intentions." He handed her a card with a phone number written on it. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen. She worked with your uncle briefly in the early 80s, before the shutdown. She's retired now, living under a different name, but she's willing to help verify the research and guide you through the science. Call her. Soon." Elena pocketed the card, feeling the weight of it as though it were made of lead rather than paper. The meeting concluded with paperwork she barely comprehended, her signature appearing on documents that bound her to obligations she was still trying to understand. Outside, the fog had thickened further, reducing visibility to a few feet. She held Sofia close as they walked, both of them silent, processing what had just shifted in their lives. The motel room waited, cold and temporary, a reminder that they had nowhere permanent to go except back to the life they had fled. But that life was already receding, becoming impossible to return to even if she wanted to. The research station was not home yet, but it was becoming something inevitable, a gravity that would not release her now that she had entered its orbit. She called Dr. Chen from a payphone, explaining who she was and why she was calling. The woman's voice was cautious at first, then warming as Elena described what she had found in the laboratory. "Tomas actually did it," Chen said softly, wonder evident in her tone. "He isolated the compounds. I told him it was impossible, that the properties were too unstable to maintain outside the natural environment. But he was always stubborn about impossible things. Can you help me understand what he created?" "I can try, but Elena, and I'll call you Elena. If that's all right, understanding is the easy part. Deciding what to do with that understanding is where it gets complicated. Your uncle struggled with that for decades. It's what kept him isolated, what eventually killed him, I think. The burden of knowing what he had and being unable to share it safely." They arranged to meet the following day. Elena hung up, feeling both relieved and more frightened than before. Every step forward seemed to confirm that the inheritance was real, that the numbers and promises were not delusion or exaggeration. And with each confirmation came the growing awareness that she was now responsible for something far beyond her capacity to protect. That night, lying beside Sofia in the narrow motel bed, Elena allowed herself to imagine what it would mean to succeed. The Trust's resources could rebuild the research station, make it secure and functional. The compounds could be tested, verified, potentially brought to market in ways that would fund continued research. Lives could be saved, not hypothetically, but actually, measurably saved. And she could provide for Sofia in ways that went beyond survival, that offered education and opportunity, and a future not defined by the limitations that had shaped Elena's own life. But imagination also brought darker possibilities. The people watching the research station, the reporter who had already found them, the federal agencies that had shut down the research once before, they all represented forces that could overwhelm her before she ever had a chance to fulfill her uncle's vision. She thought of the photograph she had found, of herself as a baby in her mother's arms, kept by a man who had known of her existence but had never made contact. Had he been protecting her by staying away? Had he understood even then that proximity to his work was dangerous? And if he had known the risks, what did it mean that he had ultimately left everything to her? The answer came to her slowly, shaped by exhaustion and the strange clarity that sometimes emerged at the edges of sleep. Her uncle had not left her an inheritance. He had left her a choice. The trust's conditions were not obstacles but tests, ways of ensuring that whoever took possession of his life's work would do so with full understanding of what they were accepting. She could walk away, disclaim the trust, return to her previous life, let the research foundation handle the compounds according to their own judgment. No one would fault her for choosing safety over uncertainty. But walking away would mean abandoning not just the money, but the possibility that her daughter might grow up in a world where the woman who raised her had chosen courage over fear, action over paralysis. It would mean teaching Sofia that inheritance was only worth accepting when it came without cost. Elena had spent her entire life receiving things that came with conditions, wages that required exhaustion, assistance that required humiliation, shelter that required accepting whatever deterioration came with affordability. The research station was different. It was a burden, certainly, but it was also a choice. And choice, she was learning, was the most valuable inheritance anyone could receive. She fell asleep with her arm around her daughter, the fog pressing against the window like something patient, something willing to wait as long as necessary for the answers it knew were coming. The next morning brought Dr. Sarah Chen to Whitehaven Point, arriving in a car that looked too new and too expensive for someone who had supposedly retired into obscurity. Elena met her at the research station, Marcus having already confirmed that no other vehicles had approached during the night. Chen was in her 70s, her hair silver and cut short, her eyes sharp, with an intelligence that age had refined rather than dimmed. She studied the building from a distance first, taking in its decay, then approached with careful steps, as though afraid it might collapse under attention. "I haven't been here since 1983, she said quietly. Tomas had just been told to shut everything down. I tried to convince him to come with me, to find work elsewhere. He looked at me like I had suggested abandoning a child." She smiled sadly. "I suppose, in a way, that's exactly what he would have been doing." Inside, Elena led her down through the hatch and into the laboratory. Chen's reaction was immediate and profound. She moved through the space like someone revisiting a place they had loved and lost, her hands trailing over equipment, her eyes taking in modifications and improvements that spoke of decades of solitary work. "He did it," she whispered, approaching the containment unit holding the fog. "He actually stabilized it. Do you understand how impossible this should be? The properties that make this fog unique are the same properties that should make it impossible to contain for more than a few hours." "Can you explain it to me?" Elena asked. "All of it. I need to understand what I'm responsible for." Chen turned to face her, and in that moment, Elena saw not judgment, but recognition. "Your uncle was studying something that exists in the border zone between meteorology and biology. The fog that appears along this coast under specific conditions carries microorganisms. We didn't have a name for them in the 80s, and I'm not sure we have an adequate one now. They're neither virus nor bacteria, but something that shares properties with both, while being fundamentally different. She moved to the control panel, pulling up screens that displayed molecular structures Elena could not interpret. These organisms interact with mammalian neural tissue in ways we still don't fully understand. In the wild, in uncontrolled exposure, they can cause the symptoms your uncle documented in 1982: confusion, memory disturbance, altered consciousness. But in controlled doses, isolated and refined, they appear to facilitate neural repair at a level we've never achieved with conventional medicine. So, the pharmaceutical value is real. Real? Chen laughed, the sound carrying an edge of bitterness. It's revolutionary. If these compounds can do what Tomas claimed, and the data here suggests they can, we're talking about treatments that would obsolete entire categories of current medication. Alzheimer's patients regaining cognitive function, stroke victims recovering abilities we currently consider lost forever. The applications are almost limitless. Then, why did the government shut him down? Chen's expression darkened. Because the same properties that enable healing can enable harm. In the wrong doses, with the wrong delivery mechanism, these organisms could be weaponized. The federal government recognized that in 1982, and their response was to classify the entire research program. Tomas was ordered to destroy all samples and never speak of his work again. But he didn't. No. He believed, and I think he was right, that suppressing the research entirely was morally indefensible. Yes, the compounds could be dangerous. But people were already dying from the conditions these compounds might treat. Destroying the only potential cure, because it might also be a weapon, struck him as a form of murder by omission. Elena absorbed this, feeling the weight of her uncle's choice settling over her. He had spent 40 years alone, maintaining research that could save lives, knowing that revealing it might lead to its confiscation or militarization. "What do I do with it now?" Elena asked. "The trust requires me to make good faith efforts toward ethical use, but I don't know what that means in practical terms." Chen was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. "Your uncle and I discussed this once, years ago, before everything fell apart. He believed the only ethical path was to maintain the research in a state of readiness until conditions changed enough that it could be released safely. He was waiting for a time when pharmaceutical research had enough transparency, enough public oversight, that his compounds couldn't simply be buried or monopolized. And has that time come? I don't know. Maybe. There are organizations now, research collectives that operate with open-source principles, that prioritize access over profit. If you could partner with one of them, establish terms that guaranteed the compounds would be available affordably. She trailed off, then shook her head. But approaching anyone means exposure, and exposure means risk, not just to you, but to the research itself. They spent hours going through the notebooks together, Chen explaining sections Elena had not understood, confirming that the documented results were consistent with legitimate research methodology. By the time they emerged back into the gray daylight, Elena had a clearer picture of what she possessed and what it would take to fulfill the trust's requirements. But clarity brought its own form of terror. The compounds in the laboratory represented potential salvation for thousands, maybe millions, of people suffering from conditions that current medicine could not adequately address. And she, a single mother with no scientific training, no resources beyond what the trust provided, no protection beyond an elderly attorney, and a retired researcher was now the gatekeeper. Chen left with promises to help however she could, but also with warnings. Be careful who you trust. There are people who have been waiting decades for this research to resurface. Some of them will approach with offers that sound generous. Others will simply try to take what you have. Neither group will care about your uncle's vision or the patients who need these treatments. They'll care about control. Elena watched her drive away, the car disappearing into fog that seemed thicker than ever, as though the landscape itself were responding to the disturbance of secrets kept too long. She returned inside to find Sofia had fallen asleep on the cot they had set up in one of the upstairs rooms, her small body curled around the stuffed animal that had been her constant companion through every move, every upheaval. Looking at her daughter, Elena felt the full weight of responsibility crystallize into something approaching resolve. Sofia deserved to grow up in a world where people chose to heal rather than harm, where scientific discoveries were used to reduce suffering rather than increase profit. And if Elena did nothing, if she let fear or inadequacy paralyze her, she would be teaching her daughter a different lesson, that ordinary people should not attempt extraordinary things, that the world was shaped only by those with power and credentials. She descended once more into the laboratory, this time with purpose that felt less like curiosity and more like commitment. She began photographing equipment, documenting the setup, creating records that would exist independently of this place. If something happened to the research station, if the compounds were confiscated or destroyed, at least there would be proof of what had existed, what had been possible. She worked through the afternoon and into evening, until her phone's battery died and her back ached from hunching over notebooks. When she finally climbed back upstairs, she found Marcus waiting, his expression serious. "The reporter came back," he said without preamble, this time with a camera crew. "I turned them away again. But they're not going to stop. They're parked down the road, waiting. They know something's here worth documenting." Elena felt her stomach drop. "How long do I have?" "Maybe a day, maybe less. Once they decide to push harder, I can't stop them legally. And if they get footage of this place, if they start asking the right questions." He did not need to finish. She understood. The secret her uncle had kept for 40 years was unraveling, exposure coming not through deliberate revelation, but through the simple accumulation of attention. Every day she stayed here, every person who saw her coming and going, every question asked by curious locals, they all contributed to a pattern that would eventually become visible to anyone looking. The decision formed itself without conscious deliberation. They could not stay here, not now, not while the research station was the obvious focus of interest. But leaving meant abandoning the compounds, trusting that security measures would hold against people determined to discover what lay beneath. Unless she took the most critical materials with her. The thought was simultaneously logical and insane. Moving the compounds meant transporting materials she barely understood, substances that could be dangerous if mishandled. But leaving them meant accepting that she might return to find them gone, confiscated by authorities who would invoke the same national security claims that had shut down the research decades ago. She made the choice knowing it was probably wrong, probably reckless, but also understanding that perfect safety was an illusion. Every option carried risk. The only question was which risk she was willing to accept. She spent the next hours carefully following procedures outlined in her uncle's notebooks, using equipment he had designed for exactly this purpose. Small containment units, portable and insulated, capable of maintaining the cryogenic temperatures necessary to keep the compounds stable. She could not take everything. The bulk of the materials would have to remain in the laboratory, but she could take samples, enough to continue the research elsewhere if necessary. By midnight, she had packed everything that would fit into a reinforced case that looked like luggage but weighed far more. Sofia slept through the preparation, exhausted by days of upheaval, her breathing soft and regular. Elena watched her daughter for a long moment, memorizing the peace of her expression, knowing that peace was about to become even more rare. Marcus drove them to a location he would not name in advance, a small house on the outskirts of a town 40 miles inland. It belonged to his sister, he explained, who was traveling and would not return for weeks. They could stay there while Elena figured out her next move. The house was modest but clean, its windows offering views of ordinary suburban streets rather than fog-shrouded coastline. Elena carried the case inside with exaggerated care, setting it in a closet that locked, then returned to help Sofia settle into a strange bed in a strange room. "Are we going to live here now?" Sofia asked sleepily. "For a little while," Elena said, smoothing her daughter's hair, "until we figure out what comes next." "I liked the big building better. It was like a castle." Elena smiled despite everything. "Maybe we'll go back someday, when it's safe." She did not sleep that night. Instead, she sat in the small living room with her phone charging, scrolling through news articles and research papers, trying to educate herself on topics she had never imagined needing to understand. Neuropharmacology, regulatory approval processes for experimental treatments, patent law, and intellectual property protection. The information was overwhelming, a cascade of specialized knowledge that seemed designed to exclude people like her. But she read anyway, absorbing what she could, building a foundation of understanding one article at a time. Around 3 in the morning, her phone buzzed with an alert. A news article, published just minutes earlier. Mystery surrounds deceased researcher's coastal property. The reporter had gone ahead with his story. Though without access, he had been forced to rely on speculation and unnamed sources. The article described the research station as abandoned but potentially significant, hinting at classified research that had been conducted there decades ago. It quoted a former government employee who suggested that materials of national security interest might still be present at the site. Elena read the article twice, feeling the walls closing in. The exposure was beginning, the slow revelation that would eventually bring attention she could not deflect. Her name was not mentioned yet, but it would be soon. And with her name would come scrutiny of her background, her qualifications, her right to possess what she had inherited. She looked at the closet where the case was locked, at the door beyond which her daughter slept, at the window showing a world that was still dark, but would soon wake to a day that might change everything. Her uncle had faced this same decision 40 years ago. Reveal what he knew and lose control, or stay silent and bear the burden alone. He had chosen silence, had carried the weight until it killed him. Elena was beginning to understand why. But she was also beginning to understand that his choice had been made in a different time. Under different circumstances, the world had changed. Not enough, perhaps, but some. And she had something he had never possessed. A reason, beyond himself, to take the risk. Sofia would wake in a few hours, hungry and curious, full of questions about what they would do today. And Elena would have to provide answers, would have to pretend she had a plan beyond survival. But beneath that pretense, something else was forming. Not confidence. Exactly. Something harder than that. Something that felt like the beginnings of refusal. Refusal to be erased, to be dismissed, to let the extraordinary thing she had been given slip away simply because accepting it was difficult. The fog knew what had been buried, and now Elena knew too. The only question remaining was what she would do with that knowledge, and whether knowing would be enough to keep her and her daughter safe from those who had been searching for these secrets far longer than she had known they existed. The morning came with the kind of silence that felt deceptive, as though the world were holding its breath before something inevitable. Elena woke on the couch where she had finally dozed off around dawn, her neck stiff and her mind already racing through the problems that sleep had not solved. The news article was still on her phone screen, its implications no less threatening in daylight. Sofia appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes, her hair tangled from sleep. "Mama, I'm hungry." The normalcy of the request was almost jarring. Elena rose and moved through the unfamiliar kitchen, finding cereal and milk, pouring orange juice into cups that belonged to someone else's life. They ate together at a small table, Sofia chattering about a dream she had while Elena's attention divided between her daughter and the phone that kept buzzing with notifications. 3 missed calls from Rothman, 2 from numbers she did not recognize, and a text message from Marcus that simply read, "Station surrounded. Media plus others. Don't come back." Her hands trembled as she set the phone down. It was happening faster than she had anticipated, the convergence of attention on the research station, pulling in not just reporters, but whoever else had been waiting for this moment. She imagined her uncle's laboratory being invaded, equipment dismantled, compounds confiscated, 40 years of careful work erased in an afternoon. Unless they found nothing worth taking, unless the most critical materials were already somewhere else. She called Rothman from the landline, not trusting her cell phone's security. He answered immediately, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Where are you?" "Somewhere safe." "What's happening at the station?" "Federal agents arrived an hour ago with a warrant. They're citing national security concerns related to classified research conducted on the property in the 1980 seconds. The warrant is broad enough to authorize confiscation of any materials they deem relevant." He paused. "Elena, did you remove anything from the laboratory?" She hesitated, aware that she was about to cross a line that could make her legally vulnerable. "Some samples. For analysis. Nothing that would compromise the bulk of the research." "Good." The single word carried a weight of relief and approval. "Let them take what they find. Your uncle planned for this possibility. The critical compounds are stored in containers designed to appear inert unless you know exactly what you're looking for. They'll inventory equipment, take photographs, but unless they bring in experts who worked on the original research, and those experts are either dead or have signed non-disclosure agreements that still hold, they won't understand what they're seeing." "What about the notebooks?" "Those were never kept in the laboratory. Your uncle maintained duplicates in a secure location. The notebooks they'll find contain only procedural information, nothing that would allow someone to replicate the research independently." Elena felt some of the tension in her chest ease slightly. Her uncle had been more paranoid than she had realized, and for once, paranoia was serving a useful purpose. "What do I do now?" "You stay hidden while I manage the legal challenges. The Trust's protections extend to defending against improper seizure, but only if we can demonstrate that the materials belong to a legitimate private research program rather than abandoned government property. That demonstration will take time." After hanging up, Elena spent the day in a state of suspended animation, unable to move forward but unwilling to retreat. She kept Sofia occupied with activities scavenged from the house books, puzzles, art supplies, left behind by children who had grown and gone. Every hour brought new developments that she tracked through news alerts and messages from Rothman. The federal agents had indeed confiscated equipment from the laboratory, but their public statements were vague, referring only to materials related to historical government research. No mention of active compounds or pharmaceutical applications. Either they had not found the critical materials, or they were deliberately obscuring what they had discovered. By evening, Elena had made a decision that terrified her even as it formed. Hiding would protect her and Sofia in the short term, but it would also ensure that control of her uncle's research passed to others by default. If she wanted to honor the trust's requirements, if she wanted to fulfill her uncle's vision, she needed to stop reacting and start acting. She called Dr. Chen, using a number the researcher had left for emergencies. When Chen answered, Elena could hear traffic noise in the background, the sound of a city that was not Whitehaven Point. "I need your help," Elena said without preamble. "Not advice, actual help. I have samples of the compounds, and I need to know if they can be verified independently before someone takes them from me." Chen was quiet for a long moment. Verification would require access to specialized equipment and expertise that won't come cheap or discreet. "Are you certain you want to pursue this? Once you open that door, you can't close it again." "I'm certain." "Then, I know someone. A colleague who runs a private research facility in Portland. She owes me favors from a long time ago, and she has the discretion and equipment you'll need." "But Elena, understand what you're proposing. If the compounds verify as legitimate, their value becomes undeniable. You'll have proof, but you'll also have a target on your back that won't go away." "I already have a target. At least this way, I'll have ammunition to defend myself." They arranged the details carefully, using terminology that would mean nothing to anyone monitoring the conversation. Elena would travel to Portland within the week, bringing samples that would be tested under controlled conditions by researchers Chen trusted. The results would be documented independently, creating evidence that could support the trust's claims if legal challenges escalated. The trip would mean taking Sofia out of school, though she had already missed days since the inheritance began, and spending money Elena could not easily replace. But the alternative was waiting for others to determine her fate, and she had spent too much of her life in that position to accept it now. 3 days later, they boarded a bus headed north, the reinforced case locked and secured in the luggage compartment in a way that made Elena's heart race every time she thought about it. Sofia sat beside her, excited by the adventure of travel, unaware of the weight her mother carried. Portland appeared through rain rather than fog, the city sprawling and busy in ways that felt almost aggressive after the isolation of Whitehaven Point. Dr. Chen met them at the bus station, her expression warm, but her movements brisk with purpose. "My colleague is expecting us," Chen said, leading them to a car parked nearby. "We'll go straight to the facility. The sooner we complete the analysis, the sooner you can secure the samples again." The research facility was housed in an unmarked building in an industrial area, its exterior giving no indication of the sophisticated equipment inside. Chen led them through security protocols that included biometric verification and non-disclosure agreements. Elena signed without fully reading, trusting that Chen would not steer her toward danger. The colleague, Dr. Miriam Okafor, was younger than Elena had expected, perhaps in her early 50s, with an intensity that reminded her of her uncle's notebooks, focused, meticulous, consumed by questions that had no easy answers. "Sarah tells me you've inherited something remarkable," Okafor said, her accent carrying traces of Nigerian origins softened by decades in America. "I'll be honest, I was skeptical. Research that could revolutionize neuropharmacology doesn't usually come from abandoned coastal stations maintained by isolated researchers. But Sarah's judgment has always been sound, so I'm willing to look." Elena opened the case carefully, revealing the containment units nestled in protective foam. Okafor's eyes widened slightly, her professional composure cracking just enough to reveal genuine interest. "These are cryogenic storage units, medical grade, but modified." She examined them without touching, her gaze analytical. "If what's inside is what Sarah suggested, we'll need to maintain chain of custody protocols. Everything documented, witnessed, verifiable. Can you agree to that?" "Yes." What followed was hours of waiting while Okafor and her team worked behind closed doors, Running tests Elena could not observe, but whose importance she felt in every passing minute. Chen stayed with her and Sofia, providing coffee and conversation that felt almost normal, despite the surreal circumstances. Sofia drew pictures on scrap paper provided by lab staff, her artistic interpretation of the situation featuring scientists as superheroes and her mother as a princess guarding treasure. Elena kept the drawings, knowing she would need reminders of her daughter's perspective when her own became too dark to bear. It was nearly midnight when Okafor emerged, her expression unreadable. She gestured for Elena to follow, leading her into a conference room where data was displayed on multiple screens. "Your uncle was not exaggerating," Okafor said simply. "The compounds you brought contain biological agents unlike anything in current medical literature. They demonstrate neural regenerative properties that exceed our best experimental treatments by orders of magnitude. We ran the samples against databases of known pharmaceutical compounds, and there's no match. This is genuinely novel." Elena felt her breath catch. So, the valuation, the 685 million, is conservative, possibly deliberately so. If these compounds can be developed into viable treatments, if the synthesis can be scaled and the delivery mechanisms refined, you're looking at applications worth billions, potentially tens of billions over time. The number was so large it ceased to have meaning. Elena sat down, feeling the weight of confirmation settling over her like a physical force. She had known intellectually that her uncle's work was valuable, but knowing and having it verified by independent experts were different experiences entirely. "What do I do with this information?" she asked quietly. Okafor considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "You have several options, none of them simple. You could sell the rights to a major pharmaceutical company. You'd become wealthy immediately, but you'd lose control over how the compounds are developed and distributed. Prices would be set by market forces, which means many people who need these treatments wouldn't be able to afford them. That's not acceptable." "I thought you'd say that. The alternative is to maintain control while seeking partnership with organizations that share your values. There are research collectives, non-profit pharmaceutical initiatives, institutions that prioritize access over profit. They'd want some ownership stake in exchange for providing development resources, but you could negotiate terms that ensure affordability. Would they protect the research, keep it from being weaponized? That's where it gets complicated. Once you bring in partners, you bring in vulnerabilities. Anyone with access to the compounds becomes a potential point of compromise. The only way to guarantee security is to maintain complete isolation, which is what your uncle did. But isolation also meant the compounds never reached the people who needed them." Chen leaned forward. "There's a third option, one that your uncle and I discussed years ago, but never pursued. You could establish your own research foundation, funded by controlled licensing of the compounds to vetted institutions. You'd maintain ownership while generating revenue that could support continued development. It would be slower than partnering with established entities, and it would require building infrastructure from nothing, but it would give you maximum control." Elena looked at the screens, displaying data she could barely interpret, at the proof that her uncle had spent 40 years developing something that could change medicine fundamentally. The weight of the decision pressed on her, not just for herself but for everyone whose suffering could be alleviated if she made the right choice and whose hope could be destroyed if she made the wrong one. "How long do I have to decide?" "Not long," Okafor said bluntly. "The samples you brought are enough to verify the compound's properties, but development would require access to the full stores you left at the research station. And from what Sarah tells me, federal authorities are currently occupying that facility. The longer they remain in possession, the more likely they are to understand what they have. At that point, your leverage disappears. The meeting concluded with Okafor providing Elena with documented results of the analysis, sealed and certified in ways that would stand up to legal scrutiny. Chen drove them to a hotel, promising to return in the morning to discuss next steps. Alone in another temporary room, Elena sat by the window and watched rain streak the glass, her mind turning over possibilities that all felt simultaneously possible and impossible. She could feel her old life slipping away, the version of herself who measured success in shifts, completed and bills paid, becoming someone whose decisions would be measured in lives saved or lost. Sofia stirred in the bed behind her, murmuring something in her sleep. Elena turned to look at her daughter, at the small form that represented everything worth protecting and everything worth risking. Her phone buzzed with a message from Rothman. Need to talk. Urgently. She called him back, keeping her voice low to avoid waking Sofia. The federal warrant has been challenged, Rothman said without greeting. The trust filed an injunction claiming improper seizure of private property. The court is requiring the government to demonstrate that the materials they confiscated were legitimately abandoned federal property rather than the product of private research conducted after government involvement ended. Can they make that demonstration? Not easily. Your uncle was meticulous about documenting that his post-1983 research was self-funded and conducted independently. But the government is arguing that any research building on their original program constitutes derivative work subject to their classification authority. It's a legal gray area that could go either way. How long until we know? The hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks from now. The judge will review evidence from both sides and issue a ruling. In the meantime, the research station remains under federal control, though they're prohibited from removing additional materials pending the court's decision. Elena felt a flare of hope. 2 weeks. It was not much, but it was time to organize, to build support, to prepare for whatever came next. I have verification results, she told Rothman. Independent analysis, confirming the compound's pharmaceutical value and uniqueness. Would that help our case? It would demonstrate that the materials have legitimate private research applications, which supports the trust's position. But Elena, be careful about revealing too much. Once the government understands the full value of what's at stake, they'll have even more incentive to claim ownership. She understood what he was not saying directly. The verification was both weapon and vulnerability, useful only if deployed at exactly the right moment. After ending the call, Elena opened her laptop and began researching the non-profit pharmaceutical initiatives Okafor had mentioned. Organizations like Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, which promoted affordable drug development. The Drugs for Neglected Diseases initiative, which focused on treatments for conditions that affected primarily poor populations. Research collectives that operated on open-source principles, sharing discoveries rather than hoarding them. Each organization had its own mission, its own compromises and constraints, but they shared a common philosophy, that scientific discovery should serve human need rather than profit maximization. It was the philosophy her uncle had lived by, dying alone rather than surrendering his work to forces that would exploit it. Elena was not alone. She had Sofia, which meant she had something to lose, but also something to fight for. And she was beginning to understand that her uncle had chosen her, not despite her lack of credentials, but because of it. She had no career to protect, no reputation to maintain, no institutional loyalties that would compromise her judgment. What she had instead was need, personal, desperate need, and the willingness to believe that people like her deserved access to the same medical miracles that wealth could buy. The next morning, Chen returned with someone unexpected. A lawyer named David Restrepo, who specialized in pharmaceutical patent law and had a reputation for taking on cases that pitted individual inventors against corporate interests. "Sarah called in a favor," Restrepo explained, his manner direct but not unkind. "She tells me you've inherited research that could be commercially valuable, but that you want to ensure it's developed ethically. That's a difficult balance, but not impossible." They spent hours discussing options, Restrepo outlining strategies that ranged from aggressive patent protection to collaborative licensing agreements that would generate revenue while restricting price gouging. The conversation was dense with legal terminology, but Restrepo had a gift for translation, converting complex concepts into language Elena could grasp. "The key," he said, "is establishing your ownership claim before anyone else can. Your uncle's documentation helps, but you need to move quickly. File patents on the specific compounds and their applications. Establish the research foundation Chen mentioned. Create a legal entity that holds the intellectual property independently of your personal assets, which protects you and your daughter if challenges arise. How much will this cost? More than you probably have available immediately. But the trust provides funding, and I'm willing to work on contingency, a percentage of future revenue rather than upfront fees. I believe in what you're trying to do, and frankly, cases like this are why I went to law school." By the time they finished, Elena had agreed to let Restrepo begin the process of establishing the legal framework for what they were calling the Reyes Research Foundation. It was named for her uncle, a memorial and a continuation, carrying forward work that deserved recognition, even if that recognition came too late for the man who had devoted his life to it. The 2 weeks before the hearing passed, in a blur of activity that felt both urgent and impossibly slow. Elena remained in Portland, too afraid of surveillance in Whitehaven Point to return to the research station. She enrolled Sofia in a temporary school program, explaining to teachers that they were in transition, a truth that understated the situation so dramatically it felt like fiction. During the days while Sofia was at school, Elena met with researchers, lawyers, and potential partners for the foundation. She learned to speak the language of pharmaceutical development, absorbing information about clinical trials, FDA approval processes, manufacturing scale-up, and distribution, logistics. Every conversation revealed new complexities, new obstacles she had not anticipated. But she also discovered something unexpected. She was not alone in wanting her uncle's vision to succeed. The researchers she met were excited by the compound's potential, yes, but also by the possibility of developing them outside traditional pharmaceutical industry structures. They were tired of watching discoveries gather dust because they were not profitable enough, tired of seeing treatments priced beyond the reach of people who needed them most. Her uncle had been isolated by necessity, but she did not have to be. She could build a network, a community of people who shared his values and had the expertise to make those values practical. The hearing arrived with the weight of inevitability. Rothman met Elena outside the federal courthouse, his expression grave, but not defeated. "They'll argue that national security requires government control of materials that could potentially be weaponized," he explained. "We'll argue that the research is demonstrably private, conducted with private funds, and protected by intellectual property rights that preceded any government interest. The judge will decide which argument has legal merit." The courtroom was smaller than Elena had expected, its wood paneling and formal atmosphere intimidating in their implications for her future. Government attorneys sat on one side, their files organized with military precision. On the other side sat Rothman and Restrepo, looking somehow both outmatched and undaunted. Elena was called to testify, her hands trembling slightly as she was sworn in. The government attorney was professional, his questions designed to establish that she lacked the expertise to safely maintain or develop the compounds. Miss Martinez, is it true that you have no formal training in chemistry, pharmacology, or any related scientific field? That's true. And prior to inheriting your uncle's property, had you ever worked in pharmaceutical research or development? No. Yet you claim the right to possess and control materials that the government believes pose potential national security risks. On what basis do you believe you're qualified to make those determinations? Elena took a breath, steadying herself. I don't claim to be qualified to make scientific determinations. That's why I've consulted with experts, including Dr. Sarah Chen, who worked on the original government research program. What I am qualified to determine is whether my uncle's work should be used to help people or to enrich corporations and government agencies that have already demonstrated they're willing to suppress treatments when it's convenient. The attorney started to object, but the judge waved him off. I'll allow it. Continue, Miss Martinez. My uncle spent 40 years developing these compounds because he believed people suffering from neurological conditions deserved treatment, even if that treatment came from sources the government wanted to classify and bury. He left his research to me not because I'm a scientist, but because I understand what it's like to need help and not be able to afford it. That perspective matters just as much as technical expertise. Rothman presented evidence next. Documentation of her uncle's independent funding. Records showing that his post-1983 research had no government support. Patents filed under pseudonyms that established prior ownership claims. The government countered with classification documents from the 1982nd, arguing that any research building on their original program was derivative and therefore subject to their authority. The hearing lasted 3 hours, ending without resolution as the judge announced she would issue a written ruling within 10 days. Elena left the courthouse feeling drained, uncertain whether her testimony had helped or damaged their case. You did well, Rothman assured her. You humanized the issue in ways legal arguments alone couldn't. The judge needs to see this as more than just a property dispute. Those 10 days were among the longest of Elena's life. She tried to maintain routines for Sofia's sake, taking her daughter to parks and libraries, reading stories at bedtime that promised happy endings. But her own sleep was fractured, filled with dreams of laboratories emptied and compounds confiscated, of returning to the life she had fled only to find it had closed around her absence. The ruling arrived via email on a Friday afternoon. Elena read it 3 times before fully absorbing its meaning. The judge had sided with the trust, finding that the government's classification claims were insufficient to override documented evidence of private research conducted independently. The materials confiscated from the research station would be returned to the trust's control within 30 days, subject to certain security requirements that Elena would need to satisfy. But there was more. The ruling specifically acknowledged the compound's potential medical value and the public interest in seeing them developed ethically. The judge had included language suggesting that the court would look favorably on efforts to ensure the treatments remained affordable and accessible, effectively endorsing the Foundation's mission before it had even formally launched. Elena sat with the laptop screen glowing before her, Sofia playing quietly nearby, and allowed herself to feel something she had not experienced in months. Victory. Not complete, not without complications, but real. She called Rothman first, then Restrepo, then Chen, each conversation adding layers of understanding to what the ruling meant practically. The research station would be returned to her control, but with requirements for security upgrades that the trust's funding would cover. The compounds could be developed, but under scrutiny that would prevent misuse. She had won the right to try, which was more than she had dared hope for when this began. That evening, she took Sofia out for dinner at a restaurant nicer than any they had visited in years, celebrating in ways her daughter could understand even if she did not grasp the full significance. They ordered dessert, something Elena would normally have declined as too expensive, and she watched Sofia's face light up with simple joy. "Mama, are we rich now?" Sofia asked, chocolate smudged on her chin. Elena wiped her daughter's face gently, considering the question. They had access to resources, yes, but those resources came with obligations that would consume years of her life. The money was not hers to spend freely, it belonged to a mission that was larger than either of them. "We're fortunate," Elena said carefully. "We have what we need, and we have the chance to help other people get what they need too. That's a kind of richness, yes." Sofia seemed satisfied with that answer, returning her attention to dessert with the uncomplicated pleasure of childhood. Elena watched her and felt the weight of the inheritance settle into something that felt less like burden and more like purpose. The return to Whitehaven Point came weeks later, after the research station had been secured according to the court's requirements. New locks, surveillance systems, climate controls for the laboratory that would maintain the compounds at optimal storage conditions. Marcus had supervised the work, ensuring that contractors understood the importance of discretion. The building looked different when Elena entered it again, less abandoned and more like what it actually was, a functional research facility maintaining materials of extraordinary value. The laboratory below had been inventoried but not disturbed beyond what federal agents had initially confiscated, and those materials had been returned as the court ordered. Standing in the underground space, Elena felt her uncle's presence more strongly than anywhere else. She could imagine him here, alone, year after year, maintaining equipment and documenting observations, carrying the weight of knowledge that could save lives, but only if he protected it from forces that would misuse it. "I'll try to do it right," she said quietly to the empty room, not quite believing in ghosts, but needing to speak the promise aloud anyway. "I'll try to make it matter." The weeks that followed brought a cascade of decisions and actions that would have overwhelmed her months earlier, but that she now approached with confidence born of necessity. The Ray's Research Foundation was formally established, its board including Chen, Okafor, and several other researchers who had worked with her uncle or who supported the mission of ethical pharmaceutical development. Licensing agreements were negotiated with universities that wanted to study the compounds, each contract carefully structured to ensure results would be published openly and treatments would be priced affordably. Revenue began to flow in, not the billions that aggressive commercial development might have generated, but enough to fund continued research and provide Elena and Sofia with stability they had never known. The reporter, who had first published speculation about the research station, requested an interview, and this time Elena agreed, but on her terms. She spoke carefully about her uncle's work, emphasizing the medical applications rather than the dramatic circumstances of discovery. The resulting article was balanced, presenting the research station as a story of dedication rather than conspiracy, of scientific persistence rewarded. Public response was cautiously positive, generating interest from patient advocacy groups whose members suffered from the conditions the compounds might treat. Elena received letters, actual physical letters, sent to the research station from people sharing stories of loved ones lost to Alzheimer's, to stroke, to traumatic brain injuries that had stolen futures. They thanked her for continuing her uncle's work, for choosing access over profit. She kept every letter, storing them in a filing cabinet in the upstairs office, reading them, when doubt threatened to paralyze her. These were the people her uncle had been working for, the ones who deserved treatments regardless of their ability to pay. Their gratitude was simultaneously humbling and empowering. 6 months after the inheritance, Elena stood at the research station's entrance and watched fog roll in from the ocean, its patterns familiar now, no longer threatening. Sofia was at school in Whitehaven Point, enrolled permanently, making friends, building a life in the town that had once felt alien but now felt possible. The research station had been transformed, not dramatically but meaningfully. The exterior was maintained, the interior modernized where necessary. The underground laboratory operated under protocols Chen had helped establish, its compounds stored and studied under conditions that balanced security with scientific progress. Elena had hired staff, a site manager to handle day-to-day operations, a security coordinator to ensure compliance with the court's requirements, an administrative assistant to manage the avalanche of correspondence and requests that the Foundation received. She was learning to delegate, to trust others with responsibilities that had initially felt too important to share. But some things she kept for herself. The final decisions about licensing agreements, the authority to approve or reject partnership proposals, the responsibility for ensuring that her uncle's vision remained intact. Even as it evolved, those remained hers, and she accepted them not as burden but as privilege. She thought often about the woman she had been when the inheritance letter first arrived, measuring her life in dollars stretched too thin, and hours worked for wages that never caught up to need. That woman still existed somewhere inside her, still flinched at prices and calculated grocery money, and feared that stability was temporary. But she had been joined by someone new, a woman who made decisions about pharmaceutical development, who negotiated with lawyers and researchers, who understood that her voice mattered in conversations she had once believed were reserved for experts and elites. The transformation was not complete. She did not know if it ever would be, but it was real, tangible, in ways that went beyond financial security. She had proven to herself and to Sofia that ordinary people could inherit extraordinary things and rise to meet them, that credentials mattered less than commitment, that the world could be shaped by those willing to carry weight others had abandoned. One evening, as she prepared to lock the research station and return to the small house she now rented in town, larger than their old apartment, with a yard where Sofia could play, she received a call from Chen. "I wanted you to know," Chen said, her voice warm with satisfaction. "We've completed the first phase of clinical trials. The results are extraordinary, Elena. Better than we hoped. Cognitive improvement in Alzheimer's patients that exceeds anything in current treatment protocols. We're moving to the next phase, but the initial data alone is going to revolutionize how we think about neurodegenerative treatment." Elena felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. My uncle would be proud. He would be, but more than that, he'd be grateful. You've done what he couldn't, brought the research into the light without surrendering it to forces that would exploit it. That takes courage he never had the chance to demonstrate. After hanging up, Elena stood in the laboratory, looking at equipment that hummed with the same steady purpose it had maintained for decades. The fog beyond the walls moved in patterns she had learned to read, no longer mysterious, simply part of the landscape that shaped this place. She thought about the people who would receive treatments developed from her uncle's compounds, who would regain abilities they had thought lost forever, whose families would be spared the slow grief of watching loved ones disappear. They would never know her uncle's name, would never understand the sacrifice that had made their healing possible. But they would heal. And that, she understood now, was enough. That was the inheritance that mattered, not the money, not the property, but the knowledge that suffering could be reduced, That one person's dedication could ripple outward through time to touch lives they would never meet. She locked the laboratory, climbed the ladder, and secured the hatch. Upstairs, she paused at the room where she had found her uncle's photograph of her mother and herself as a baby. The frame was still there, but she had added others beside it. Photos of Sofia, of the research team, of the Foundation's first board meeting. The research station was no longer a monument to isolation. It was becoming something else, a place where past and present converged, where secrets revealed became knowledge shared, where one family's tragedy had been transformed into hope for thousands. Elena drove home through fog that parted before her headlights and closed behind her taillights, the research station disappearing into grey that no longer felt oppressive but protective. She would return tomorrow, and the day after, and for as many days as the work required. But tonight, she would read stories to her daughter, tuck her into bed in a house that felt permanent, and sleep with the knowledge that she had earned the right to rest. The inheritance had been accepted, the responsibility had been met, and the future, for the first time in her life, felt like something she could shape rather than simply endure. The fog knew what had been buried, and now the world was beginning to learn, not all at once, not without complications, but steadily, inevitably, with the persistence of truth that refuses to stay hidden when its time has come. Several months later, Elena received an invitation to speak at a medical conference about the Foundation's work. Standing at a podium before an audience of researchers and clinicians, she told her uncle's story carefully, protecting details that still required protection, but honestly enough that people understood what had been at stake. She spoke about the choice between revelation and concealment, between profit and access, between the easy path and the right one. She acknowledged that the Foundation's approach was not perfect, that compromises had been necessary, that the compounds would not reach everyone who needed them as quickly as pure commercial development might have allowed. But they will reach people, she concluded, her voice steady despite nerves that had not fully abated. And when they do, those people will have access not because they can afford to pay whatever price the market will bear, but because my uncle believed, and the Foundation believes, that healing should not be a privilege reserved for those with wealth. The applause was polite, professional, but afterward, people approached her with questions and proposals, with offers of partnership and support. Not everyone agreed with the Foundation's philosophy, but enough did to make a difference, to build momentum toward the kind of pharmaceutical development her uncle had envisioned but never lived to see. Among those who approached was a woman in her 60s, her eyes bright with an emotion Elena could not quite identify. She introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Vance, saying she had worked with Tomas Reyes briefly in the early 1980 seconds before the shutdown. I tried to convince him to publish what he'd found, Vance said quietly, to claim credit before someone else could. He refused, said the credit didn't matter, only the work. I thought he was being foolish, throwing away a career for principles that would leave him forgotten. She paused, her gaze holding Elena's with intensity that felt like transmission of something important. I was wrong. He wasn't forgotten. He was patient. And by waiting, by protecting his research until the right person could inherit it, he ensured it would be used the way he intended. That's not foolishness. That's wisdom I'm only now old enough to recognize. Elena thanked her, feeling the weight of those words settle alongside all the other pieces of understanding she had gathered. Her uncle had not been perfect. His isolation had been both necessary and tragic. His secrecy had protected the research, but had also prevented collaborations that might have accelerated progress. But he had been right about the essential thing, that value was not the same as price. that some discoveries were too important to entrust to systems that prioritized profit over people, that sometimes the slowest path was the only one that led where it needed to go. She returned to Whitehaven Point with renewed clarity about the work ahead. The compounds were in clinical trials that would take years to complete. The foundation was growing, requiring more of her time and attention. Sofia was growing too, asking questions about her great-uncle's research, beginning to understand that the fog that rolled through their town had given them more than just atmosphere. It had given them purpose. And purpose, Elena was learning, was the inheritance that mattered most, not because it was easy to bear, but because it was worth bearing, because it connected her to something larger than herself, because it taught her daughter that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they refused to accept that extraordinary things were meant for someone else. The research station stood watch over the coast, its concrete and steel no longer a barrier against the world, but a bridge between what had been hidden and what could now be revealed. Inside, equipment hummed with steady purpose, maintaining compounds that would soon begin their journey from laboratory to clinic, to the lives of people who had been waiting, hoping, for exactly this kind of miracle. And in the small house in town, Elena Martinez, who had once measured her worth in minimum wages and missed opportunities, now measured it in lives that might be saved, in treatments that would be accessible, in a future her daughter would inherit that was better than the one she had known. The fog rolled in that night, as it always did, but Elena no longer watched it with uncertainty. She knew its secrets now, and she knew that sometimes the most valuable things in the world were hidden precisely where everyone had been taught not to look, not because they were meant to stay hidden, but because they were waiting for the right person to find them, someone who would understand not just what they were worth, but what they were for. She had been that person, and she would continue to be, for as long as the work required, for as many lives as the compounds could touch, for as many years as it took to transform her uncle's solitary dedication into collective healing. The inheritance was not money, it was not property, it was responsibility, and she had accepted it fully, carrying it forward into a future that finally felt like something worth reaching for. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.